And we have an argument structure in which every utterance can be coded into something like this. I know it's kind of small, but statements that are assertions, propositions, elaborations, amplifications, justifications, agreement and knowledge, objections. All of these have definitions. So if I have 10 pages of manuscript, all of the utterances, and actually the thought units that each one makes from the very first one to, let's say, 2,000, from 1 to 2,000 are coded and put into these categories. That's an argument. That's an objection. That's a statement of agreement. That's a statement of disagreement. We're looking at how they build arguments. We're looking at how arguments build, right? In conversation, not formal structure arguments, like in logic, but how they build in conversation, right? And this is the sort of thing that we could spend more time talking about, but I think you understand essentially how it works. It lays out these things. And then puts them into these categories: arguables, assertions and elaborations and propositions. You're not trying to, you're not concerned with security, you're concerned with punishing us. That's an arguable statement. We can make that statement as being arguable. Reinforcers are things that agree. You can simply agree. Prompters are disagreements, objections. Objections plus have data and attached to it, and challenges. And then framing. Framing is when you share a little something in between the two sides. So one side says, we've suffered a lot of violence, and the other side says, we understand that, but we've suffered it too. We understand that as a frame. It's sharing some sort of overlap. Let's get to the conclusions here. We then put it in a matrix and looked at what someone started with. When a Palestinian initiated either an arguable or reinforcer or a frame, what did an Israeli respond with in that part of the matrix? When a Palestinian initiated an arguable, they responded statistically significantly with another arguable. Now, that simply is rather obvious. You would expect Palestinians and Israelis to argue in argument cycles, right? And they do, all right? And that's what that data indicates. The Israelis respond also with reinforcers and with frames. The Israelis respond very, very specifically, to Palestinian arguments. Now look, when Israelis begin with an arguable and a Palestinian responds, you get only across the top row of the matrix. The Palestinians respond with other arguments. That's the cycle of argument I was talking about. You would expect that. And they cycle, and they also with prompters and frames, across only arguables, not these others, down here. Now, what does this mean? All right. Basically, this is a contingency matrix that looks at what happens when an Israeli says something. What does a Palestinian follow with? When a Palestinian initiates something, what's an Israeli follow with? They're building, as we looked at all the data, they're building arguments. Right? And you can see the kind of arguments that they build. And here's the conclusions we came to. The findings support minority-majority relations. All right? The Palestinians build a lot more arguments, a lot stronger, and a lot more complex. The Palestinians are actually better at building more complex arguments in this data. Zupnik points out, in terms of the issue of being Dugri, and you would all know, of course, better than me, that Zupnik, in this one study she did, said that Israelis are more Dugri with each other, and they're not so Dugri outside of their own culture. So that's why the Dugri theory that they were going to argue in a manner consistent with being Dugri did not play out. There's probably some truth to that. Contact moderates Israeli argument tendencies, but it does not eliminate it. There's plenty of argument, but it moderated it. There's more argument by Palestinians, like I just said. They're empowered, stronger. Israelis respond with arguments. Palestinians respond with more variety and complexity. Israelis don't develop very, very well developed arguments. In this literature, and I'll finish with this, in this coding scheme, there's arguments that are what are called developed. Argument followed by a response, followed by data, followed by a follow-up, etc. They're more developed. Israelis actually develop in these arguments, in these data, and there's not really much difference. The Palestinians are a little better, but the difference is very minor. What are called stunted arguments. They're undeveloped. They're undeveloped. You get that. You get those stunted arguments. You get undeveloped arguments when people are sort of lashing out at one another. You did this. No, hell with you. No, I didn't. You know, that kind of thing. And that's the level of, that's the quality level that you're at here. You're not at a high level quality of working with, to develop arguments. There's lots of issues here. There's lots of implications in terms of trying to improve things. On occasion, I've tried to design some studies with some friends to try to teach people to argue better. That hasn't worked out very well because people don't want to be taught and they don't want to listen. It's too difficult, and there are lots of politics involved here, as you can imagine. I don't do obviously I don't do the collection. I don't get the people, and I don't organize. I do analysis and writing and a lot of involvement in every other way. But I don't organize people, obviously, since I'm not Israeli and I'm not here. I'm not able to do that. And finding people to take part in these kinds of things, is also difficult. I do think that ultimately these kinds of issues of talking to one another in a particular way is going to make a difference. It's going to be important. It is the essence. Argument is the essence of deliberation. I don't have any illusions that Israelis and Palestinians are all of a sudden going to develop skills at arguing and then come up with wonderful answers. But they do need to develop ways to relate to one another. Not everyone believes that. I talk to plenty of people who don't want to think about it, but assuming the current situation is not sustainable, assuming something happens in one way or the other, assuming something happens on a grassroots level, I'm not talking about peace agreements at a more abstract state political level, then this kind of communication is going to be implicated. Thank you. Question? On the average, it doesn't. The social conformity strictures are strong enough that people actually do, tend to like each other and come together a little bit more often than not. And that gets maximized even if, to the extent that you can manage the conditions of contact. This is a statistical model that we developed and tested out, the structural equation model. Very simply, it takes intergroup meetings. It took Israelis and Palestinians. I did this with a colleague at the Hebrew University. And they were looking for the likelihood of integrative solutions that integrated the issues of both sides. It satisfied you and satisfied me. Not me winning the argument or you winning the argument, but integrating with one another, all right? And the single path that's statistically significant, that's the most important thing that leads to integrative solutions, and you know this, is trust. If the two sides trust each other, if two people trust each other. You know that, but it is strong evidence for what you have to do to get to the point of getting quality solutions. And trust is an interpersonal sort of phenomenon. You got to trust the person you're working with. There's a lot more very interesting work on the difference between, and I'm not going to go into it because I just don't have time, the difference between interpersonal issues, I trust you, you trust me, and group level trust, right? We all have attitudes about ourselves. As you might say, as a Jew, do you feel vulnerable? And you might say, personally, do I feel vulnerable? No, I don't feel vulnerable. Do you think your group is vulnerable? And you might say, yeah, I do think they're vulnerable. All right? So you can have an attitude about yourself as a member of a group, like an ethnic or a religious group, and the group itself. And the group itself. One of the things that does point out is that interpersonal relations generalize to the group. They don't guarantee it, but they generalize it. If you're from another ethnic group and I'm from another ethnic group, if we have an interpersonal relationship, and it's a quality one based on shared categories of interest, we tend to generalize it up to the group. Nothing magical about it. Doesn't mean I'm going to all of a sudden make all the problems go away, but it does improve the process of generalizing positively to the group. So trust is a very important factor here. I take a little shot here at peace education. It's okay. I mean, I've written a chapter for a book on peace education. Gabi Solomon at Haifa, you know that name? He's written a lot about peace education. But I make the distinction between peace education and what we're doing. Here's some data on the results of various kinds of contact in taking part in some studies. It's pretty simple. These are non-participants, and what they had to do was they had to read and study the narrative of the other side. And we had them read the two sides and try to learn something about each side's narrative. These were non-participants. You see there was no difference. You know, pre-test and post-test Israelis, no difference. But you can see what happens here in the post-test with the participants in this study. Okay? Both sides, you know, increase positive responses. So the act of an Israeli Jew learning about the narrative of the Palestinian unfreezes him a little bit. And the same thing with the Palestinian. Again, it doesn't mean they don't, 5 minutes after the experiment, doesn't mean they don't go back to where they started. And just like Seeds of Peace, you know that organization, you probably heard that they bring kids from the conflicts, you know, to camp in Maine in the United States. And their data shows that once they go back home, especially the Israelis go into the military, etc., they resort pretty much to similar sort of attitudes, all right? So, I mean, these things do change, and there's nothing magical about them. But for starters, they are making some progress. This is the same kind of data on advocating war, as opposed to participants in a sort of peace education kind of a process.
And this is, if I understand correctly, Palestinians advocating more war, or I didn't understand what it means.
In the post-test, right? In the post-test, after the Palestinians did advocate more war when they didn't participate in the attempt to teach them about the other side. I want to show you what we did in terms of analyzing this very specific issues of argument. Very specific issues. We devised a coding scheme, and we tested some theories. On the basis of some of these issues, we made some predictions about how they should argue. Okay? Dugri and Musayara, right? Israeli, you know, Tamar Katriel of Haifa University has written a very important book on Israeli Dugri speech, and Musayara is the counterpoint of its communication style, right, for the Arab cultures, all right. And Israelis, of course, you would expect, you know, to be more argumentative, all right. That's part of the cultural stereotype. That's part of the Israeli Dugri speech. That's part of what you would expect. And for the Palestinians to be more Musayara, which means to go along and get along. And we just use a variety of these things to make predictions. Okay? There's another theory of, one of the theories was that the way they talk to their speech styles, communication styles, like Dugri and Musayara, you know, makes a difference. Right? Another theory is what's called minority-majority theory. Right? This is a theory that says minorities, the Palestinians in this case, usually take an advantage of the opportunity and do better in communication situations because it's a situation in which they have more control. And they're not weak. If they're capable of it, they can argue, they can verbalize, and they use the situation to get what they want. And we do find that in this data. The stereotypes about more assertive, argumentative-based Jews actually doesn't hold. The Jews and the Israeli Jews in these data kick back, you know, quite a bit. Now, there's reasons for that also that are not part of the study. Part of it is who takes part in these things. I can't get hardcore conservative religious people to take part very much, so most of them are a little bit liberal anyway, right? So that's a bit of a problem. But you do find that, you know, in the minority. Israelis more defensive. Communication is a way for minorities to be heard and exercise power. Minorities tend to like communication situations because they tend to exercise power. What we did is we got some data. We used it, got it on the internet. We worked with Gershon Baskin. You probably know him at IPCRI. We got some data with him, in which we had Israelis and Palestinians discussing issues and arguing on the internet. We then take their